He was sitting right there, close enough for me to hear his breathing, to notice the way he shifted in his chair, to feel the warmth of his presence beside me. Nothing was wrong in a way that could be pointed at. No tension, no raised voice, no visible distance. And yet, I had never felt so alone while someone was physically with me. I remember trying to convince myself that I was imagining it, that not every quiet moment means something, that closeness doesn't always need words. But the feeling didn't come from silence. It came from absence. From the space between us that wasn't filled by conversation, eye contact, or attention. He was there, undeniably present, and somehow completely elsewhere. What unsettled me most was how normal everything looked. Anyone watching us would have seen two people sharing a moment, existing side by side without friction. There was nothing to explain, nothing to justify discomfort. And that made it harder to trust what I felt. When nothing appears wrong, you start questioning your own awareness before questioning the situation. I noticed how careful I became, how I adjusted my posture, softened my tone, delayed reactions. I didn't want to disturb the calm, to demand something that might expose what was missing. So I stayed quiet, hoping presence would arrive on its own. It didn't. And the longer I waited, the clearer it became that proximity and connection are not the same thing. That night didn't end badly. We spoke about ordinary things. We shared the space without conflict. But something shifted inside me, quietly and without announcement. Because realizing someone can be with you without being with you changes how you understand closeness. And once you feel that difference, it doesn't disappear when the night ends. It stays, asking questions you can't unlearn how to hear. I didn't want to name what I was feeling that night. Naming it would have made it real, and reality would have required something from me. So I stayed inside the quiet, telling myself that closeness doesn't always look the same, that not every shared moment needs intensity to be valid. I had learned how to lower my expectations without admitting I was doing it. What made it difficult was how familiar this kind of absence felt. It wasn't new, just clearer. I recognized the pattern, being near someone while slowly adjusting to their distance. It didn't arrive as rejection. It arrived as subtle disengagement, as attention that drifted elsewhere while the body remained. I found myself watching him more than interacting with him. Not in a suspicious way, but in a searching one, looking for signs of presence in small gestures, brief eye contact, shifts in tone. Each time I noticed the absence instead, I softened my reaction, reminding myself not to demand what wasn't being offered. Silence became a way of protecting the moment from disappointment. The longer we stayed there, the more I felt myself receding. Not pulling away completely, just enough to match the distance I sensed. I mirrored his absence without naming it, believing this would keep things balanced. What I didn't realize was that balance built on absence doesn't feel steady, it feels hollow. Looking back, that night wasn't about him leaving emotionally. It was about me noticing that I had learned how to stay when presence wasn't mutual. Some moments don't break you. They clarify something you've been quietly adapting to for a long time. And that night, without confrontation or words, I began to see the cost of remaining where connection wasn't fully available. After that night, I began to notice how often presence was something I negotiated rather than received. I didn't ask for it directly. I adjusted myself instead. I spoke less when attention drifted. I filled silences that weren't being met. I learned how to stay without asking to be seen. What unsettled me wasn't his absence alone. It was how easily I adapted to it. I told myself that people show care differently, that closeness doesn't always need intensity, that expecting too much creates pressure. Those thoughts felt reasonable, even generous. But they also taught me how to lower my needs quietly, without admitting what I was giving up. I started replaying that night in small fragments. Not the conversation, but the lack of it. The way my words softened before leaving my mouth. the moments I paused, waiting for engagement that never arrived. None of it was dramatic enough to confront, but all of it added weight. I noticed how careful I had become with my reactions. I didn't want to seem demanding. I didn't want to disrupt the calm. So I stayed attentive, supportive, easy to be with. From the outside, I was present. From the inside, I was waiting. Over time, that waiting became familiar. I learned how to anticipate distance and adjust before it was felt. I didn't name the absence. I absorbed it. That absorption felt like patience at first. Eventually, it felt like disappearance. There were moments when I felt strangely invisible, not ignored, not dismissed, just unseen. I was there, contributing, listening, existing beside him. But the connection felt one-sided, as if I were reaching across a space that wasn't being bridged back. I realized how much effort it took to maintain that dynamic. I had to stay emotionally alert, noticing when to lean in and when to pull back. That vigilance was exhausting in ways I hadn't allowed myself to recognize. What looked like ease from the outside was sustained by constant internal calculation. I began to question what closeness actually meant to me, whether being physically together was enough, whether presence could be felt without attention. Those questions didn't demand answers yet, but they stayed with me, reshaping how I understood connection. The night he was there but not with me wasn't an isolated moment. It was a lens. Once I noticed it, I began seeing similar absences elsewhere. In conversations, in shared spaces, in moments that looked intact but felt incomplete. And with that awareness came something quieter and heavier than disappointment. The realization that I had learned how to stay where presence wasn't mutual, that I had mistaken endurance for intimacy, and that recognizing this wasn't about blaming him. It was about noticing what I had been quietly accepting for far too long. What stayed with me most after that night wasn't sadness. It was clarity. A quiet understanding that something essential had been missing, even while everything appeared intact. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel wronged. I felt aware. And awareness, once it settles in, doesn't fade easily. I began noticing how often I filled the space between us, how quickly I responded, how carefully I listened, how much effort I put into keeping the connection alive. It wasn't mutual, but it was consistent. And consistency can look like stability when you don't stop to ask who is carrying it. There were moments when I wondered if I was asking for too much, if wanting presence was unrealistic, if my need for connection was simply misaligned with his way of being. Those questions felt safer than acknowledging the possibility that I was staying in something that wasn't meeting me where I stood. I noticed how easily I explained his absence away. He was tired, distracted, busy. None of those explanations were false, but they were incomplete. They allowed me to remain without confronting the larger truth, that being physically close doesn't guarantee emotional availability. I began to feel the imbalance more clearly, not as pain, but as effort. I was leaning in while he remained still. I was adjusting while he stayed unchanged. That asymmetry didn't explode into conflict. It settled into routine, making it harder to recognize as something worth questioning. What unsettled me was how familiar this pattern felt. How often I had accepted partial presence as enough. How quickly I learned to be grateful for proximity when what I really wanted was engagement. That realization didn't accuse him. It reflected back on me. I realized how much patience I had practiced. Not patience rooted in understanding, but patience born from hope. The hope that presence would arrive eventually, if I waited long enough. That hope kept me quiet, attentive, available, and slowly depleted. There were moments when I felt myself becoming smaller in that dynamic. Not invisible, but quieter, less expressive, more careful. I didn't want to demand what wasn't freely given, so I adapted instead, believing this was a form of care. But care that only moves in one direction begins to feel heavy. And heaviness, when carried long enough, turns into distance. Not between bodies, but between who you are and who you allow yourself to be. That night had shown me something I couldn't ignore anymore. Not about him, but about how easily I stayed when presence wasn't mutual. And once I saw that, I knew the story wasn't heading toward confrontation. It was heading toward a quieter, harder question. How long I could remain in a space where I was present for someone who wasn't fully there for me. At some point, I stopped wondering whether he would show up differently. The question quietly shifted inward. How long I was willing to keep showing up this way. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently, carefully, always adjusting to an absence that had become familiar. I noticed how much of my energy went into staying available, how often I waited for engagement instead of expecting it. I had learned how to be present without being met, how to contribute without receiving the same attention in return. That imbalance didn't hurt immediately. It settled slowly, shaping the way I understood closeness. There were moments when I felt proud of my patience. I told myself that love, connection, commitment all require endurance, that staying calm and accommodating was a sign of maturity. But beneath that pride was a quieter realization. Endurance without reciprocity turns into self-erasure. I began to recognize how silence played a role in maintaining this dynamic. I didn't voice what I was missing. I didn't ask for more presence. Not because I didn't want it, but because I had learned how fragile the calm felt. Silence kept things stable, and stability felt safer than risking a truth I wasn't sure would be received. I noticed how often I edited myself, how quickly I softened emotions that might require response, how easily I convinced myself that wanting more was asking too much. Those adjustments felt small in the moment, but together, they created distance, not between us, but between me and myself. There were moments when the loneliness surfaced clearly, not when I was alone, but when we were together. That was the hardest part to admit. Being near someone while feeling unseen creates a unique kind of ache, quiet, persistent, difficult to explain. I realized then that presence isn't proven by proximity. It's felt through attention, engagement, mutual awareness. And without those, togetherness becomes a performance rather than a connection. I had been performing presence for both of us, hoping it would eventually be shared. What unsettled me most was how long I had accepted this version of closeness, how easily I adjusted my expectations rather than questioning the dynamic itself. I didn't want to disrupt what existed, but in protecting it, I was slowly disappearing inside it. That night, the one where he was there but not with me, wasn't a moment of loss. It was a moment of recognition, a realization that something essential had been missing, and that my silence had been helping it stay that way. And standing in that awareness, still calm, still composed, I understood that the story wasn't moving toward confrontation. It was moving toward a decision. Not about him, but about whether I could continue to remain present in a space where my presence wasn't truly returned. I didn't leave that night with a decision already made. There was no dramatic clarity, no sudden resolve. What I carried with me instead was awareness, the kind that doesn't shout, but doesn't let you rest the same way again. I understood then that being present for someone who isn't fully with you slowly teaches you to accept less than you feel. Not because you want to, but because silence makes endurance look like strength. There is a quiet difference between patience and disappearance, between giving space and erasing yourself inside it. That night showed me how easily closeness can exist without connection, how easily bodies can share space while attention lives elsewhere. And it reminded me of something simple, but difficult to ignore once seen. Presence is not proven by staying. It is felt when you are met, when your attention is returned, when you don't have to become smaller to keep something intact. If you stayed with this story until the end, thank you. Some stories don't arrive to tell you what to do next. They arrive to sit beside something you already feel. If this moment felt familiar, let that recognition remain gentle. There are more stories like this waiting, quiet, honest, and unafraid to look at what happens when someone is there, but not truly with us. If you return for the next one, we'll continue together, listening closely to what presence really asks of us, and what we no longer need to lose in silence.